The smell hit them first. Samuel Bordeaux would remember that detail for the rest of his life, how the stench rolled across Gator Lake like a physical thing, thick enough to taste. Rotting cabbage mixed with sulfur and something else, something organic and wrong that made his throat close and his eyes water. 23 men working the cypress stands that July morning in 1907, and every last one of them stopped what they were doing to retch into the black water. But it was Jimmy Tate who found the tracks. Pressed deep into the mud at the water's edge, each print was longer than a man's forearm and nearly as wide. 5 toes, clearly defined, with what looked like claw marks extending beyond each digit. The heel sank so deep that Jimmy could fit his fist into the depression. Something had stood there in the night, something heavy enough to leave impressions in ground that barely held the weight of their logging skiffs. Big Jim Morrison, camp foreman for the Cummer Lumber Company, took one look and walked away. Didn't say a word, just turned his back on the deepest timber contract in north central Florida and headed for the rail spur. Left his crew standing there with their cross-cut saws and cant hooks, staring at proof that something impossible had visited their camp. 18 loggers went into the Withlacoochee swamp that summer. 7 came out. The rest simply vanished into the cypress and palmetto scrub, swallowed by something the local Seminole called Esti Kapkaki, the tall man who walked where no man should walk. My name is Samuel Bordeaux. I was 24 that summer, young enough to think I understood the swamp and fool enough to stay when wiser men fled. I've kept silent for 67 years, watched the newspapers call it accidents and exposure, watched other survivors drink themselves to death rather than speak the truth. I'm 91 now. The doctors say my heart won't last another winter. Before I die, someone needs to know what really happened in those cypress stands, not because anyone can stop it. You can't, and besides, I don't know if it's still there, but because 11 good men died, and they deserve to be remembered as more than swamp fever and gator attacks. This is what I saw. This is what hunted us. This is what I've carried for 7 decades. The Withlacoochee swamp in 1907 stretched across 3 counties of central Florida, a maze of black water channels and cypress domes that had never felt an axe. The Cummer Company held timber rights to 40,000 acres, the largest virgin cypress tract left in the state. They called it the Blackwater Contract, 1 million board feet of premium lumber worth more money than most men saw in a lifetime. But the swamp didn't want to give up its trees. We should have known from the trouble we had getting in. The mule teams balked at the water, rolling their eyes and planting their hooves like they sensed something waiting in the darkness under the canopy. It took 3 days to establish our base camp on Gator Lake, a natural clearing about 6 miles into the swamp where the cypress thinned enough to let in some sky. The smell started the first night, not the normal swamp smells, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, the musky scent of alligators sunning on fallen logs. This was different, sharper. It drifted through the camp like fog, settling over our bedrolls and seeping into our clothes until we could taste it on our tongues. Jimmy Tate said it reminded him of a rendering plant he'd worked near in Jacksonville. Pete Calhoun thought it smelled like something dead left too long in the sun. I thought it smelled like warning. The second morning brought the first signs of disturbance, tools scattered that had been neatly arranged the night before. Our cook fire spread into a perfect circle of ash, as if something had systematically kicked the burning logs in all directions. The water barrel overturned, though no man remembered hearing it fall. "Probably a bear," said Big Jim Morrison, though his voice carried no conviction. "Black bears will get into anything that smells like food." But we all knew better. Florida black bears were small, timid creatures that avoided human camps. They didn't arrange scattered axes in neat rows or stack overturned buckets in precise pyramids. They certainly didn't have the strength to flip a 200-pound water barrel without making enough noise to wake 18 sleeping men. By the third day, the pattern was undeniable. Each morning revealed new evidence of a visitor or visitors, with intelligence enough to explore, but restraint enough not to destroy. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen, just examined, rearranged. As if something was studying us, learning our habits and routines with the patience of a natural scientist. The men grew jumpy. Conversations died when the wind shifted and brought that smell drifting through the camp. We found ourselves checking over our shoulders, scanning the tree line for movement that never quite materialized. Even the wildlife seemed affected. The usual chorus of frogs and insects fell silent after sunset, leaving only the whisper of wind through cypress needles and the occasional splash of a gator sliding off a log. It was Roberto Silva who first suggested we weren't alone. Roberto was our Seminole guide, a quiet man in his 50s who knew the swamp like most men know their own backyards. His grandfather had been one of the warriors who fought alongside Osceola, and Roberto carried that legacy in the careful way he moved through the wilderness, reading signs and interpreting the language of the wetlands that the rest of us could barely begin to understand. "Something walks here," he said on our fourth evening, his voice barely audible over the crackling campfire. "Something that shouldn't be." Big Jim snorted. "Christ, Roberto, you sound like an old woman telling ghost stories. It's probably just panthers, or maybe some vagrant living rough in the deep swamp." Roberto's dark eyes reflected the firelight as he shook his head slowly. "Panthers don't stack wood. Vagrants don't move without sound." He gestured toward the darkness beyond our circle of light. "This is old country. Old things live here. Things that remember when the white man first came and before." "What kind of things?" asked Jimmy Tate, his young voice tight with nerves. Roberto was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of generations of tribal memory. "My grandfather called it Esti Kapkaki, the tall man. Said it lived in the deepest part of the swamp, where the water runs black and the trees grow so thick that day looks like twilight. Most times it keeps to itself. But sometimes..." Roberto poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the humid night air. "Sometimes men go where they shouldn't go, take things that don't belong to them. Then the tall man comes calling." "Horse shit," Big Jim declared, but I noticed he kept his voice low. "Seminole superstition. We got a job to do here, boys. 40,000 acres of prime cypress ain't gonna cut itself." But Roberto's words had planted seeds of unease that grew stronger with each passing day. The disturbances escalated. Our tent stakes were pulled up and driven into the ground in perfect geometric patterns. The cross-cut saws were removed from their racks and arranged in a circle around our cold cook fire, their teeth glinting in the morning sun like some primitive altar. And always that smell. Stronger now, more persistent. It clung to everything. Our clothes, our bedding, even our food. A few of the men complained of headaches and nausea. Others reported strange dreams of being watched by glowing eyes in the darkness. On the seventh night, we got our first clear glimpse of what had been visiting our camp. I was on watch duty, sitting on a fallen log near the edge of our clearing with a Winchester rifle across my knees. The fire had burned down to coals, and most of the men were snoring in their bedrolls. The night was unusually quiet. Even the insects had fallen silent, as if the entire swamp was holding its breath. That's when I saw the trees move, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind that night. Moving with purpose, the branches parting as something large passed between them. At first I thought it might be one of the men answering nature's call, but the movement was wrong, too fluid, too deliberate, and too tall. I raised the rifle and called out softly, "Who's there?" The movement stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds, everything was perfectly still. Then, from the darkness between two massive cypress trunks about 50 yards from our camp, I saw a pair of eyes catch and reflect the dying firelight. They were positioned at least 7 feet off the ground, those eyes, set in what I could barely make out as a large, dark shape that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows. As I watched, frozen with a mixture of fear and fascination, the shape shifted slightly. I caught a glimpse of massive shoulders, arms that hung nearly to what I assumed were its knees, and the suggestion of a face that was almost human, but profoundly wrong. The smell hit me then, that rotting cabbage stench, but concentrated, overwhelming. My eyes watered and my throat closed, but I managed to keep the rifle trained on those glowing eyes. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey, though I wasn't entirely sure which was which. Then it was gone. No sound, no disturbance in the underbrush. One moment the eyes were there, reflecting orange in the firelight, and the next there was only darkness and the gradual return of normal swamp sounds. I didn't wake the camp. What would I have told them? That I'd seen a pair of eyes in the woods? That something tall and dark had been watching us sleep? In the morning light, with coffee warming my belly and the sun burning off the night's mysteries, it was easy to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. And Roberto's knowing look, when he found fresh tracks at the spot where I'd seen those eyes, told me he knew better too. The tracks were different this time, clearer. The creature had stood in one place long enough to leave detailed impressions in the soft mud. 5 toes, as before, but now I could make out what looked like the ball of a foot, an arch, even the suggestion of individual toe pads. Most unsettling of all, the tracks showed a stride pattern that was unmistakably bipedal. Whatever had made them walked upright, like a man, like a very large man with very large feet and very long arms. "Esti kapkaki," Roberto murmured, kneeling beside the clearest print. "He's curious about you. That's not good." "What do you mean, curious?" Roberto stood and brushed mud from his hands. "Means he's trying to figure out what you are, whether you're a threat, whether you're interesting." He met my eyes with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sometimes that curiosity leads to trouble. That afternoon, working the saw with Jimmy Tate on a massive cypress about a quarter mile from camp, I began to understand what Roberto meant. We'd been cutting for about 2 hours, the rhythmic back and forth of the crosscut, saw creating a steady music that echoed across the black water. The tree was old-growth virgin timber, easily 6 feet in diameter and worth more than most men made in a year. We were maybe halfway through when Jimmy suddenly stopped pulling. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened. Over the normal sounds of the swamp, birds calling, water lapping against cypress knees, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, I could hear something else, a rustling in the underbrush, methodical and persistent, something large moving through the palmetto scrub, circling our position. "Probably just a deer," I said, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. The rustling stopped. In the sudden silence, I became aware of how isolated we were, how far from camp, how vulnerable. The thick canopy above us filtered the sunlight into a greenish twilight that made distances deceptive and shadows deep. Anything could be watching us from 10 feet away and remain completely invisible. Then came the sound that made Jimmy drop his end of the saw, a low vocalization, somewhere between a growl and what I can only describe as a chuckle. It seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the water and filtering through the trees until its source was impossible to pinpoint. But it was unmistakably intelligent, unmistakably amused. "Jesus Christ," Jimmy breathed. "What was that?" I grabbed our axes and thrust one into Jimmy's trembling hands. "We're heading back to camp, now." We abandoned the half-cut tree and made our way as quickly as we dared through the swamp, sloshing through knee-deep water and scrambling over fallen logs. Behind us, that low chuckling continued, keeping pace with our retreat. Once I glanced back and thought I saw something large moving parallel to us, maintaining its distance but matching our speed with an ease that suggested it could close the gap anytime it chose. We reached camp in record time, both of us breathing hard and soaked with swamp water and nervous sweat. Big Jim took one look at our faces and knew something had gone seriously wrong. "What happened out there?" Between gasps, I managed to explain about the circling sounds and the vocalization. Jimmy added details about the way the very air seemed to change, becoming thick and oppressive, charged with a presence that made the hair on our necks stand up. Big Jim listened with growing concern. When we finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Pack it up," he said finally. "We're moving camp." "Moving where?" asked Pete Calhoun. "Closer to the rail spur. This deep swamp. Maybe we bit off more than we can chew." But even as we broke down our equipment and loaded the skiffs, I knew it was too late. Whatever lived in these cypress stands had taken notice of us, had been studying us, learning about us, perhaps even toying with us. Moving camp might buy us some time, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. We had invaded something's territory, and now it was deciding what to do about us. The new camp, established on higher ground about 2 miles closer to the railroad, felt more secure at first. We were out of the deepest part of the swamp, in an area where the cypress gave way to mixed hardwoods and the canopy was thin enough to let in real sunlight. The oppressive atmosphere of our first sight seemed to lift, and for a few days the men's spirits improved. But the smell followed us. Not constant now, but periodic, drifting through our new clearing like an unwelcome visitor. It came most often in the early morning hours, just before dawn, as if something was conducting regular inspections of our camp. We posted guards, but they never saw anything. Just that occasional stench and sometimes the sound of something large moving just beyond the edge of visibility. Roberto grew increasingly agitated. He spent his days reading sign in the surrounding forest, returning each evening with reports that made no sense and worried him deeply. "Tracks everywhere," he would mutter, sketching patterns in the dirt with a stick. "But they don't follow. They circle, watch, wait." Wait for what? Roberto's dark eyes found mine across the campfire. "For us to make mistake. Do something that changes the game." "What kind of mistake?" But Roberto just shook his head and stared into the flames. We found out 3 nights later when the thing finally showed itself in full. I was awakened by screaming, raw, primal sounds of terror that cut through the humid night like a blade. Rolling out of my bedroll, I grabbed my rifle and stumbled toward the sound. Other men were doing the same, their faces pale in the moonlight that filtered through the trees. The screaming was coming from the direction of the makeshift latrine we dug at the edge of camp. As we approached, flashlights and lanterns throwing crazy shadows through the underbrush, the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. We found Charlie Moss about 10 yards past the latrine, standing perfectly still with his back to us. His work pants were around his ankles, his shirt torn almost completely off. He was staring into the forest with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. "Charlie?" Big Jim called softly. "Charlie, you all right?" Charlie didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear us. He stood there like a statue, his whole body trembling, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness that the rest of us couldn't see. That's when we smelled it. That rotting cabbage stench, stronger than ever, rolling over us in waves that made several of the men gag. And with it came another smell, something musky and wild and primitively masculine, like the den of some great predator. Big Jim approached Charlie slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. When he reached out to touch Charlie's shoulder, the young logger let out a whimper and collapsed. We caught him before he hit the ground, and that's when we saw the scratches. 4 parallel lines across his back, each about 8 inches long, not deep enough to be life-threatening, but deep enough to leave scars. The spacing suggested fingers, very large fingers with very sharp nails. Whatever had touched Charlie Moss had left its calling card. As we carried Charlie back to the fire, I noticed Roberto standing at the edge of our group, his face grim in the lantern light. He was staring at something on the ground, fresh tracks in the soft earth, larger and clearer than any we'd seen before. This time, there was no ambiguity about what had made them. The creature had stood upright on 2 legs, close enough to touch a terrified man, patient enough to let him live. The tracks told the whole story: approach, contact, withdrawal, methodical, deliberate. "It's escalating," Roberto said quietly. "What do you mean?" "First it watches, then it touches, next..." Roberto shook his head. "Next, somebody doesn't come back." Charlie Moss recovered consciousness an hour later, but he was never the same. He spoke in whispers when he spoke at all, jumping at every sound and refusing to go anywhere alone. When we pressed him for details about what he'd seen, his eyes would go wide and he'd shake his head violently, as if the very memory was too terrible to voice. The only thing he ever said about that night came 3 days later, as we were loading equipment for yet another attempt to relocate our operation. Charlie grabbed my arm with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. "It was smiling," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Jesus help me, Sam, the thing was smiling." That night, Big Jim made the decision that would cost us everything. "We're not running anymore," he announced, standing before our demoralized crew with his jaw set in that stubborn line I'd learned to recognize. "Cummer Company's paying us good money to harvest this timber, and by God, that's what we're going to do." Roberto stepped forward from the shadows. "This is mistake, Morrison. The tall man, he's done playing games," Charlie was warning. "Charlie had a run-in with a bear or a panther," Big Jim shot back, though his voice carried no conviction. Probably surprised at taking a drink, got scratched up and scared, that's all. Bears don't smile, said Jimmy Tate quietly. Big Jim whirled on him. You keep that kind of talk to yourself, boy. We got work to do and I won't have superstitious nonsense undermining this operation. But the damage was done. The men were spooked, jumping at shadows and working in tight groups even during daylight hours. Productivity dropped to almost nothing as loggers spent more time watching the tree line than cutting timber. The few trees we did manage to fell were left where they'd dropped. Nobody wanted to venture into the deep swamp to buck them into manageable lengths. On our second day back in the timber, we lost Tommy Chen. Tommy was our youngest logger, barely 18 and eager to prove himself. He'd volunteered to scout ahead, looking for the next stand of virgin cypress, while the rest of us finished delimbing a massive tree we'd dropped the day before. We gave him a whistle to signal if he found anything promising and told him to be back by midday. Noon came and went. No whistle, no Tommy. By 2 o'clock, Big Jim organized a search party. We spread out in a rough line, calling Tommy's name and listening for any response. The swamp swallowed our voices like it swallowed everything else. Sound seeming to travel only a few yards before disappearing into the moss-draped silence. We found his axe first, lying on a patch of higher ground, about a half-mile from where we'd last seen him. The handle was slick with something that wasn't water, and the blade was embedded 3 inches deep in the trunk of a cypress tree, as if Tommy had swung it with desperate force before losing his grip. 50 yards beyond that, we found his shirt. It hung from a low branch like a flag of surrender, torn into ribbons but arranged almost decoratively, as if someone had taken care in its placement. The fabric was stained with mud, and something darker, something that drew flies in lazy circles. Jesus, whispered Pete Calhoun. What could do that to a shirt? Roberto knelt beside the base of the tree, studying the ground with the intensity of a man reading scripture. When he stood, his face was grim. He ran, Roberto said simply. Fast as he could, but not fast enough. The tracks told the story Roberto's words couldn't. Tommy's boot prints showed first a normal walking pace, then increasingly frantic running. But alongside his tracks, matching his pace with terrifying ease, were the now familiar impressions of something much larger. The creature had followed Tommy Chen like a cat playing with wounded prey, close enough to touch him, but choosing instead to let the chase continue. The trail led deeper into the swamp, toward a section of water so black it looked like spilled ink. Roberto followed the tracks to the water's edge, then stopped abruptly. This is far as we go, he announced. The hell it is, Big Jim growled. Tommy's out there somewhere. Maybe hurt, maybe... Tommy's gone, Roberto interrupted. His voice carried a finality that silenced argument. And if we follow those tracks into the deep water, we'll be gone too. You don't know that, Roberto pointed to the water. In the soft mud at the very edge, 2 sets of tracks were clearly visible. Tommy's boots, and beside them, the creature's massive prints. But only one set led back out of the water. I know, Roberto said quietly. We searched for another hour, calling Tommy's name until our voices were hoarse, but found nothing more. As the afternoon light began to fade and the shadows between the cypress trunks grew longer and deeper, Big Jim finally admitted defeat. We'll come back tomorrow, he promised, but everyone knew it was an empty gesture. The swamp had claimed Tommy Chen, and all the searching in the world wouldn't bring him back. That night, the creature came for Eddie Wilkins. Eddie was on guard duty, sitting by the banked coals of our campfire with a shotgun across his knees. The rest of us were in our bedrolls, though sleep was proving elusive. Every sound, every splash of a gator slipping into water, every creak of settling wood sent jolts of adrenaline through our exhausted bodies. I was drifting in that uneasy space between waking and sleeping when Eddie's scream shattered the night. Not the extended cry of someone in prolonged pain, but a short, sharp shriek that cut off abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. We rolled out of our blankets, grabbing weapons and lanterns. The fire had died to barely glowing embers, leaving our campsite in near total darkness. In the weak light of our oil lamps, I could see Eddie's overturned chair, his shotgun lying in the dirt with both barrels discharged. But no Eddie. Spread out, Big Jim ordered, his voice tight with controlled panic. Search in pairs, nobody goes alone. We combed every inch of the surrounding forest, following drag marks and broken branches, calling Eddie's name into the humid night. The trail was easy to follow at first, deep gouges in the earth where Eddie had been pulled along, his heels digging furrows in the soft ground. But after about 100 yards, the marks simply stopped. It was as if Eddie Wilkins had been lifted into the air and carried away. Roberto found something that made the rest of us gather around him in a tight, frightened circle. Pressed deep into the mud beside the last of the drag marks was a single, perfect handprint. Not human, too large, fingers too long, palm too broad. But unmistakably, the print of something with opposable thumbs and the intelligence to use them. "It carries them," Roberto said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Takes them up into the canopy where we can't follow." "Why?" asked Jimmy Tate. "What does it want with them?" Roberto's eyes found mine in the lantern light. "Same thing any predator wants? To feed." The words hung in the humid air like a death sentence. We all understood now what we were dealing with. Not just some oversized animal defending its territory, but something that actively hunted human beings. Something smart enough to separate us from the group, patient enough to stalk its prey, strong enough to carry a grown man into the treetops. "Pack everything," Big Jim ordered. "We're leaving, now." "In the dark?" Pete Calhoun asked. "Jim, we can barely see 10 feet in any direction." "I don't care if we have to crawl back to the rail spur on our hands and knees," Big Jim replied. "We're not spending another night in this godforsaken swamp." It took us 2 hours to break camp and load our equipment into the skiffs. All around us, the swamp seemed to be watching, waiting. That rotting cabbage smell drifted through the trees in waves, sometimes so strong it made us gag, other times fading to barely detectable traces that might have been imagination. But it was always there, reminding us we weren't alone. We launched the skiffs just after midnight, navigating by compass and memory through channels that looked completely different in the darkness. The water was like black glass, disturbed only by our passage and the occasional V-shaped wake of an alligator. Our pole lamps threw circles of yellow light that seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness of the swamp. I was in the lead skiff with Roberto and Jimmy Tate, poling through water that barely covered the cypress knees. Behind us, the other 2 boats followed in single file, their lights bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps through the Spanish moss that hung from every branch. We'd been traveling for maybe an hour when Roberto suddenly stopped poling. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I heard only the normal sounds of the swamp, water lapping against the boats, the distant splash of night hunters, the rustle of wind through palmetto fronds. Then, gradually, I became aware of something else. A rhythmic splashing, keeping pace with our boats but maintaining its distance. Something was following us through the water. "Jesus," Jimmy breathed. "How fast can those things swim?" Roberto's face was grim in the lamplight. "Fast enough." The splashing grew closer, more distinct. I could make out individual strokes now, powerful and methodical. Whatever was following us moved through the water with the efficiency of something perfectly adapted to its environment. "There," Jimmy pointed to our left, where ripples were spreading across the still water. "I can see the wake." In the weak glow of our pole lamp, we could just make out a V-shaped disturbance moving parallel to our course. But what chilled my blood was the realization that the wake was too large for any animal I knew. The thing creating those ripples had to be enormous. Big Jim's voice carried across the water from the boat behind us. "Sam, you see something?" Before I could answer, the wake changed direction. Instead of following us, it angled toward our lead skiff with unmistakable intent. The water began to churn as whatever was beneath the surface increased its speed. "Pull!" Roberto shouted. "Pull like your life depends on it!" We drove our poles into the muddy bottom and pushed with desperate strength. The skiff surged forward, but our pursuer was faster. The wake closed the distance with terrifying speed, and I caught a glimpse of something dark and massive just beneath the surface. 20 feet, 15, 10. Then, just as I was certain the thing would surface right beside our boat, the wake veered away. We watched in stunned silence as whatever had been chasing us disappeared into the darkness, leaving only spreading ripples to mark its passage. "Why did it stop?" Jimmy asked, his voice shaking. Roberto was staring at the water where the creature had vanished, his expression troubled. "It's hurting us." "Hurting us where?" Roberto pointed ahead to where the channel we'd been following split into two narrower passages, deeper into the swamp, away from the rail spur. I understood then what the creature was doing. It wasn't trying to catch us, not yet. It was driving us like a sheepdog drives sheep, forcing us to take the route it wanted us to take, leading us toward some predetermined destination where the game would finally end. "Back up," I called to the other boats. "We're going back." But when we tried to reverse course, we discovered the creature had anticipated that move as well. Behind us, the water erupted in an explosion of spray and fury. Something huge and dark rose partially from the swamp, water cascading from massive shoulders as it blocked our retreat with its sheer physical presence. In the weak light of our lamps, I got my first clear look at the thing that had been hunting us. It stood chest-deep in the black water, easily 8 feet tall, even partially submerged. The torso was powerfully built, covered in dark hair that glistened with moisture. The arms were disproportionately long, hanging nearly to the waterline, ending in hands that looked almost human except for their size and the curved claws that tipped each finger. But it was the face that froze my blood. Almost human, but wrong in every detail. The features were too large, too primitive, shaped by some evolutionary path that had diverged from humanity eons ago. And the eyes, intelligent, calculating, filled with an alien malevolence that spoke of hunger and patience and terrible purpose. As we stared in horrified fascination, the creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile. Rows of yellowed teeth were revealed, far too many for any human mouth, arranged in a predator's grin that promised pain and death. Then it spoke. Not words exactly, but a sound that was unmistakably vocal communication, a low rumbling that rose and fell in patterns that suggested meaning, intelligence, intent. The sound seemed to come from deep in its chest, vibrating across the water with the authority of absolute predation. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered from one of the boats behind us. "It's talking to us." The creature made the sound again, longer this time, almost conversational. Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so large, it sank back beneath the surface and disappeared. We sat there in our skiffs for several long minutes, pole lamps casting nervous circles of light on water that had returned to mirror stillness. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We were all trying to process what we'd just witnessed. The intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate nature of the creature's actions, the terrifying implications of that almost smile. Finally, Big Jim's voice broke the silence. "Which way do we go?" Roberto studied the two channels ahead of us, reading the water like a book written in a language only he understood. Both passages looked equally dark, equally uninviting. But one led toward the railroad and safety. The other led deeper into the heart of the swamp. "The creature wants us to take the left channel," Roberto said finally. "It's been pushing us that way all night." "So we take the right one," Roberto shook his head. "It knows we'll think that. Too easy." He pointed toward the right-hand passage. "That way leads to the deep sloughs, dead ends and gator holes. If it gets us back there, we're trapped." "Then what do we do?" Roberto was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed to lead to the same terrible conclusion. "We give it what it wants," he said finally. "Take the left channel, but we go fast and we go ready to fight." We redistributed the weapons, shotguns, rifles, axes, anything that could serve as a weapon in close quarters. The men's faces were pale in the lamplight, but I saw no cowardice there. These were working men, accustomed to danger, willing to face whatever waited ahead if it meant getting home to their families. The left channel was narrower than the main waterway, barely wide enough for our skiffs to pass single file. Cypress trees crowded close on both sides, their gnarled roots creating a maze of passages and blind corners. Spanish moss hung so low we had to duck to avoid it, and more than once I felt something brush against my face that might have been vegetation, or might have been something else entirely. The smell grew stronger as we penetrated deeper into this part of the swamp. That rotting cabbage stench mixed with the musky odor of large animals. And something else, something that reminded me of an abattoir, sharp and metallic and wrong. We'd been poling for about 20 minutes when Jimmy suddenly grabbed my arm. "Sam," he whispered, "look at the trees." I followed his gaze upward and felt my heart stop. In the twisted branches above us, shapes were moving. Dark forms that swung from tree to tree with fluid grace, keeping pace with our boats but staying just beyond the reach of our lights. Not one creature. Several. "How many?" I asked Roberto, not taking my eyes off the canopy. "Hard to tell," he replied grimly. "At least 3, maybe more." The shapes followed us for another quarter mile, occasionally visible as patches of darkness against the slightly lighter sky. Sometimes one would drop to a lower branch, allowing us a brief glimpse of glowing eyes or massive shoulders, but they maintained their distance, content for now to simply observe our progress through their territory. Then, the channel opened into a natural clearing, a circular pool perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by ancient cypress trees that rose like cathedral columns into the night sky. In the center of the pool, a small island of higher ground was crowned with the pale bones of some long-dead tree. This was where the creature had been leading us. I knew it with the certainty of a man facing his executioner. This was the killing ground. "Back up," Big Jim called from the rear boat. "This feels like a trap." But when we tried to reverse course, we discovered the channel behind us had been blocked. Fallen trees, or trees that had been pushed over, now barred our retreat. We were committed to whatever waited in that moonlit clearing. The creatures in the canopy had gone silent. No more movement in the branches, no more glimpses of dark shapes against the sky. It was as if the entire swamp was holding its breath, waiting for something to begin. That's when we heard the sound that chilled our souls, low at first, like distant thunder, then rising in pitch and volume until it filled the clearing with primal fury. It was a howl of triumph, of hunger, of terrible anticipation, and it was coming from all around us, multiple voices joining in a chorus that spoke of intelligence, coordination, pack behavior. We were not dealing with a single creature. We were surrounded by an entire group of them. The attack came from 3 directions at once. The first creature emerged from the water directly in front of our lead skiff, rising like some primordial god from the black depths. Water cascaded from its massive frame as it reached for Jimmy Tate with arms that spanned the width of our boat. I swung my axe with all the strength I possessed, catching the thing across the forearm. The blade bit deep, drawing a roar of pain and rage, but the creature barely seemed to notice. One massive hand closed around Jimmy's shirt and lifted him from the boat as easily as a child picks up a doll. Jimmy's scream cut across the water like a knife. He beat at the creature's arm with his fists, but he might as well have been fighting a tree trunk. The thing held him at arm's length for a moment, studying him with those terrible, intelligent eyes. Then, almost casually, it backhanded him across the face. The sound of breaking bones was audible even over the chaos of battle. Jimmy's head snapped back at an impossible angle, and his screaming stopped instantly. The creature released him, and his body splashed into the water like a discarded rag. Behind us, shotgun blasts echoed across the clearing as Big Jim and his crew fought their own battle. I could hear cursing, screaming, the wet sounds of violence and darkness, but I had no time to look. The creature that had killed Jimmy was reaching for me now, its claws extended like curved daggers. Roberto saved my life. His pole caught the creature in the throat, driving it backward into the water with a splash that sent waves across the small pool. The thing surfaced immediately, unhurt but momentarily stunned. Roberto was already reloading, working the lever action of his rifle with practiced speed. "The island!" he shouted. "Get to the island!" I pulled with desperate strength toward the small patch of higher ground in the center of the clearing. Behind us, the creature thrashed in the water, its roars of fury echoing off the surrounding trees. More shapes were emerging from the darkness. How many, I couldn't tell. Too many. Our skiff ground against the muddy shore of the island, and Roberto and I scrambled onto solid ground. The little patch of earth was maybe 20 feet across, crowned with the bleached skeleton of what had once been a massive cypress. Fallen logs provided some cover, and the elevation gave us a clear field of fire in all directions. From the water around us came sounds I'll never forget. The screams of dying men, the splash of massive bodies moving through the swamp, the triumphant howls of successful predators. Of the 18 men who had entered the Withlacoochee swamp that summer, only Roberto and I remained alive. We made our stand there on that tiny island, back to back against the fallen tree, rifles ready. The creatures circled us like sharks, occasionally breaking the surface to study us with those terrifying, intelligent eyes. Sometimes one would venture close enough for a shot, and Roberto proved to be deadly accurate. His bullets found their mark again and again, drawing roars of pain and rage from the darkness. But we both knew it was only a matter of time. We had maybe 20 rounds between us, and there were at least half a dozen creatures in the water around our island. They were patient, these things. They could wait us out, let exhaustion and despair do their work before moving in for the final assault. Dawn was breaking over the swamp when Roberto made his decision. "I'm going to try to reach the boats," he said quietly, checking his ammunition. "Create a distraction. Maybe you can get away in the confusion." "Roberto, no. They'll tear you apart." He smiled, the first smile I'd seen from him in days. "Maybe. But you got a wife waiting in Gainesville. Children. I got nobody." He worked the action of his rifle one last time. "Besides, this is my swamp. My fight." Before I could stop him, Roberto was in the water, swimming toward the nearest skiff with powerful strokes. The creatures reacted instantly, converging on him from all sides, but Roberto was ready for them. His rifle cracked again and again as he trod water, each shot finding its target with deadly precision. One creature fell back with a bullet in its skull. Another clutched a shattered shoulder and sank beneath the surface. But there were too many of them, and Roberto's ammunition was running low. I heard the click of an empty chamber just as the largest of the creatures, the one I'd first seen blocking our retreat, reached him. Roberto had one moment to meet those terrible eyes before massive hands closed around his throat. The water turned red around them. Roberto's struggle lasted perhaps 30 seconds before his body went limp. The creature held him underwater for a full minute, making certain of its kill, then released the body to float face down among the cypress knees. Now I was alone. The remaining creatures turned their attention to me, and I could see the intelligence in their approach. No more random attacks or displays of fury. They were methodical now, calculating. Two of them began swimming toward opposite sides of the island, while a third remained in the center of the pool, watching. I had 6 rounds left in my rifle. Against 3 of those things, it might as well have been 6 popgun pellets. But as the creatures reached the shore of my tiny refuge, something unexpected happened. The largest of them, their leader, I realized, made a sound that was unmistakably a command. The others stopped their advance and looked to him for instruction. What followed was the most terrifying conversation of my life. The leader spoke in that rumbling, almost language I'd heard before. The others responded in kind, their voices rising and falling in patterns that suggested discussion, debate, decision-making. They were talking about me, I realized, deciding my fate with the casual deliberation of men choosing what to have for breakfast. Finally, the leader made what was clearly a final pronouncement. The others responded with sounds that might have been agreement or disappointment. I couldn't tell which. Then, to my amazement, they began to withdraw, not fleeing, withdrawing. There was a crucial difference. The leader remained in the center of the pool, watching me with those intelligent eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost conversational. He was speaking to me directly now, and though I couldn't understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. I was being allowed to leave. Why? I'll never know. Perhaps I had fought bravely enough to earn their respect. Perhaps killing Roberto had satisfied their hunger for vengeance. Or perhaps, and this thought chills me even now, they simply found it amusing to let one human live to carry the story of what had happened in the Withlacoochee swamp. The leader made one final sound, a low rumble that might have been a farewell or a warning. Then, he sank beneath the surface and disappeared, taking his terrible intelligence back into the dark heart of the swamp. I sat on that island for 3 hours, rifle ready, waiting for them to return. But the swamp had returned to its normal sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, the distant splash of alligators. Whatever test or judgment had taken place in those black waters was finished. Using one of the abandoned skiffs, I made my way back through the maze of channels toward the rail spur. It took me 2 days of careful navigation, sleeping in the boat and jumping at every sound. But I made it out, the only survivor of the Cummer Company's Blackwater contract. The authorities in Gainesville listened to my story with the kind of patient skepticism reserved for madmen and drunks. A logging accident, they concluded. 17 good men lost to the hazards of swamp work, gator attacks, drowning, getting lost in the maze of waterways. The official report mentioned equipment failure and suggested better safety protocols for future operations. The newspapers were more colorful, but no more accurate. "Swamp fever claims logging crew," read the headline in the Gainesville Sun. The article spoke of disease, exposure, and the well-known dangers of working in Florida's wetlands. Not a word about creatures that walked upright and spoke in rumbling voices. Roberto Silva was listed as presumed drowned. Jimmy Tate became victim of alligator attack. Tommy Chen was lost to exposure and swamp fever. 17 distinct human beings, each with families and dreams and futures that would never come to pass, were reduced to a handful of euphemisms in a dusty file. But I know the truth. I've carried it for 67 years, through marriage and children and grandchildren, through decades of ordinary life that sometimes seems like an elaborate dream compared to those terrible nights in the cypress swamps. The Withlacoochee was never logged. The Cummer Company wrote off their investment and moved operations to more accessible timber tracts. The swamp remains largely untouched even today, protected by state law and the simple fact that most people prefer their wilderness a little less wild. Sometimes hunters or fishermen go missing in that country. The papers call it accidents, getting lost, natural hazards. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe the creatures moved on long ago, or died out, or never existed at all outside the fevered imagination of a traumatized young man. But I know better. Deep in my bones, in the part of me that still wakes up screaming from dreams of glowing eyes and impossible faces, I know they're still there, still watching, still waiting for the next group of men foolish enough to invade their ancient domain. I never went back to logging, never set foot in a swamp again if I could help it, built a good life for myself in town, married a school teacher, raised 3 children, ran a hardware store that kept food on the table and a roof over our heads. Ordinary life, precious in its mundane safety. But on certain nights, when the wind is from the south and carries the smell of distant wetlands, I find myself standing at my bedroom window, watching the darkness and remembering the weight of eyes that saw too much, the sound of voices that spoke in languages older than human civilization, the terrible patience of things that could afford to wait centuries for their next meal. My Sarah passed 5 years ago. Cancer took her slow and gentle, surrounded by family in a clean hospital bed. A good death, if there is such a thing. The children are grown and scattered, busy with their own lives and families. I'm alone now with my memories and my secrets. The doctors tell me my heart won't last another winter. 91 years is a long run, they say, and my ticker is finally wearing out. I find myself strangely at peace with that news. I've lived longer than I ever expected to, certainly longer than I deserved after that night in the cypress swamp. But before I go, I wanted the truth written down. Not because I think anyone will believe it. I learned better than that long ago. Not because I'm trying to warn people away from the Withlacoochee. Those who are foolish enough to venture into the deep swamp probably wouldn't listen anyway. But because 17 good men died in that green hell, and they deserve better than to be forgotten as accidents and exposure. Because Roberto Silva died saving my life, and his courage should be remembered. Because Tommy Chen and Jimmy Tate and Eddie Wilkins and all the rest were real people with real families who mourned them, not just statistics in a company report. I'm the last one who knows what really happened. The last witness to something that probably shouldn't exist, but does. When my heart finally gives out, and it will soon, this story dies with me unless I put it down in words. So here it is. The truth about the Withlacoochee swamp. The truth about the things that walk upright in places where no man should go. The truth about intelligence that predates our civilization and patience that measures time in geological epochs rather than human lifespans. Make of it what you will. Believe it or don't, it makes no difference to me now. I've carried this burden for 67 years, and I'm tired. Tired of remembering, tired of watching the shadows, tired of jumping at every sound in the night, but the memories are clear as yesterday. The smell of rotting cabbage and something worse. The sound of Roberto's rifle echoing across black water. The weight of those terrible eyes studying me with alien intelligence. The rumbling voice that granted me mercy for reasons I'll never understand. I see them sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking. Standing at the edge of my vision, patient as stone, waiting. Not for me. I'm too old now, too broken, no longer worth the hunt. But waiting nonetheless, because that's what they do. What they've always done. The deep places of the world keep their secrets. But sometimes, if you're very unlucky or very foolish, the secrets find you first. My name is Samuel Bordeaux. I was the only survivor of the Cummer Lumber Company's Blackwater contract in the summer of 1907. 18 men went into the Withlacoochee swamp. I'm the only one who came out. This is what I saw. This is what I know. This is what I've carried. God help me. This is the truth.